Dad, may I please make an observation?
Oh, what is it?
I think this is all a charade to make Bart look more injured than he really is.
I don't mind you boys doing this in the living room, but in court, doesn't Bart have to tell the truth?
Yeah, but what is truth, if you follow me? Now, Bart, can you roll your eyes back in your head like this?
Oh, you mean like I'm dead? Yeah, sure.
The kid's a pro.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Springfield Googleplex, the movie podcast for Simpson fans, brought to you by thatshelf.com. Every episode, we talk about a movie parodied on The Simpsons. Maybe it was The Simpsons that introduced us to the film, or maybe when we finally saw it, we realized, hey, that's where that Simpsons show came from. Regardless, each week we pick one that one of us hasn't seen or hasn't seen in a while, watch it, and come together to discuss. I'm your host, Adam Scholes, and joining me, as always, is the Walter Matthau to my Jack Lemmon, my co-host, Nate Story. How are you today, buddy?
I'm good. You know, this is actually maybe one of the first ones in a while where I'm like, actually, that's pretty true.
Yeah, I think it is
totally
probably
am the Matthau to your Lemmon.
Yeah, it's definitely the most accurate one we've had so far. That I'm like, I even don't feel like, oh, that's being mean or unfair to either of us. Like, it's pretty spot on. So, yeah.
Well, and it has been true since high school.
Exactly. Yes. This week we watched Billy Wilder's underseen The Fortune Cookie from 1966, the very first team-up between the legendary comedy duo Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon. You might remember it from such Simpsons episodes as Season 2's Bart Gets Hit by a Car. And that's it. Because this is, before Nate and I started recording, we were kind of saying, like, yeah, this movie doesn't really exist. We always like to try and find one per season that will make the audience go, what the hell is this thing? I've never heard of this. And what do you mean The Simpsons parodied it? I've never heard of it. And this feels particularly apt. But it's also interesting, too, because we're going back. We're going back to Season 2, Episode 10, Bart Gets Hit by a Car, directed by Mark Kirkland, written by, unsurprisingly, John Swartzwelder. At some point, Nate, we're going to have to, do a tally of how many episodes we've covered that have been written by John Swartzwelder.
What percentage by John Swartzwelder?
Because it's got to be close to, 90%. And granted, he wrote a lot of episodes, but we seem to have an affinity for them. Original air date, January 10th, 1991. It's 24 years after the original release of the movie. And I think it's interesting because we're talking Season 2, and I don't tend to watch those early seasons, like Season 1 and 2 are kind of... Those are the ones that I've seen the least of the 13 original seasons. Because I think they're so different in style and tone.
Yes.
I wrote in my notes, even the fact that this episode has, a title card, which, Mike Reese says was a joke, because he's like, we put it in to make the audience go, wait, did all the other episodes have a title card? Which they didn't. But
That's
it's
such
just
a weird joke.
Yeah, it's just, but that's the thing, they're still really finding their footing, and this is a prime example of an episode that really has that sort of, we talked about the animated sitcom, right? This is very much a sitcom premise. You could see this on any number of, classic 90s sitcoms, and it wouldn't feel out of place.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I found the episode kind of forgettable. I don't know, would you agree?
So I totally agree with what you're saying about the tone of this one feeling very James L. Brooks to me, right?
Especially the final act.
Oh, in the final act especially, and I really dislike the final act of this one because it feels completely unearned. But what I would say is this is also a super innovative episode, right?
Yes.
And we'll get into it, but I believe the reference to this movie unlocks all this cool stuff that they then play with for the first 13 seasons. So much ground is laid here, and then they pick that up and run with it afterwards. So yeah, it's a mixed bag.
That's a perfect segue to talk about the references, because again, obviously we're going to talk more in depth about this movie that nobody has heard of, or maybe not as many people have heard of after this. But let's talk a little bit about the references in this episode. So talk us through them, Nate.
Yeah, so all right, the fortune cookie. This is a classic example of homage French for theft, which is a reference to the commentaries for The Simpsons.
Yes, an homage. French for theft.
This is probably the prime example of this, because Mike Reese on the commentary very clearly says we needed a plot for an episode, so we stole it from an old movie that no one really remembers.
Exactly.
So this whole plot is actually the plot of The Fortune Cookie, more or less. It's the premise of the episode is from The Fortune Cookie. And then they take it off in a different direction, which I think the best plot parodies on The Simpsons, in my opinion, are the ones that actually use a premise or an opening scene or something like that as a jumping off point, and then bring in other ideas that make it really Simpsons-y. Some of the parodies I haven't enjoyed as much in the more recent seasons are the like truly front to back remakes of a movie or that kind of thing, where it's not really bringing in enough of its own material. It's just kind of like a really faithful remake of something. And this is kind of the opposite of that. It's just like taking this core idea, right, the premise of this movie, and then running with it. They kind of downplay how much creativity went into this episode, but I actually think there's quite a bit. So the premise of this episode, I guess we need to say, right, is Bart gets hit by a car, right? It's in the title.
It's in the title, yeah.
But this is also the episode that introduces Lionel Hutz as a character.
One of your favorites.
One of my favorites, absolutely. So he shows up at the hospital after all of this happens and basically convinces the family to file a frivolous lawsuit against Mr. Burns, who hit Bart with the car.
Well, I mean, I don't know how frivolous he did hit the kid with the car, but yeah.
Right, sure. Pain and suffering, fair enough. But he's not super injured, you know?
Exactly. He's in what we would refer to as an ambulance chaser, I believe is the sort of term that is used for these types of lawyers. Certainly growing up watching Fox, where they would air The Simpsons, or other American networks, you would always see these sort of like, hurt in an accident, this type of lawyer that basically exists to... Have you been injured? Well, I can help you sue and make a bunch of money off of it. So
totally. I mean, one of the interesting things about this, of course, is that, like, in some ways, I think you could argue that this movie gives us Lionel Hutz.
Oh, yeah, 100%. Obviously, this is his first appearance. I think he's different from the Matthau character, at least in terms of his personality.
Yep.
And obviously, his character traits are going to become much more developed as he continues to recur throughout the show.
Right.
In this episode, he seems like he's an actual decent lawyer. He just happens to be a shyster, which is more in line with the Matthau character. But yeah, I mean, without this, we don't get him. So I think that's a very fair assessment.
Yeah, he is playing the Matthau role in the story, even though the character is very different. In the movie, as we'll get into, Walter Matthau is playing this like shyster lawyer who convinces his brother-in-law to file a lawsuit that isn't really fair. And so, yeah, Lionel Hutz is essentially playing that same role in the story, even though, especially as the show goes on, he evolves in a different direction. But it is interesting, like, in this episode, as you say, he seems a little bit more competent, but just shady and kind of a liar. But as it goes on, he becomes more incompetent, and that's kind of his defining characteristic.
Can I take this bird cage?
He's just a bad lawyer, almost getting into kind of like Gil territory at times.
Oh, very much so, yeah. No, I mean, it's such a great character, and again, we've sort of discussed that both him and Troy McClure, who is another one of your favorites. I mean, you just love the Phil Hartman characters, obviously.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's such a shame that with the passing of Phil Hartman, these characters sort of go away. Although I think respectable of the show to sort of retire the characters as a result, which they've seemingly been pretty good. You know, again, I'm not as up on the more modern seasons, but it seems like, you know, with the passing of Marsha Wallace, they sort of have retired Edna Krabappel. Like, they recognize that these characters owe a debt to the voice actor. Not every show would do that. Are there any other references outside of that plot jumping off point that you can think of?
Yeah, well, I mean, the interesting thing is that even though this is the main sort of plot reference, this episode is basically just a series of movie homages, I would say, strung together.
Yeah, totally.
And they're not even really parodies. They're mostly just like taking a scene or taking like a story element out of it and just dropping it in. So the very first one that was new to me, actually, when I was researching this episode, is apparently when Mr. Burns hits Bart with the car, he says, "Give him a nickel and let's go," right?
Yep.
And apparently that is potentially a reference to A Tale of Two Cities. There's a very similar scene where Marquis Saint-Evremond hits a kid and kills him with his carriage, and then throws a coin to his grieving father and continues on. Which makes sense for Mr. Burns. They always love throwing in those old-timey references for him.
Yeah. The best of times, the blurst of times.
Right. In that same sequence, this is actually crazy. I also sort of learned about this one fairly recently because it's a short, so it kind of is on the borderline of whether or not we include it or not.
Right.
But that whole first sequence where Bart wakes up and kind of pops out of his body as a ghost and then goes up to heaven and then goes down to hell, that is basically a remake of a Tom and Jerry short.
Oh.
Unfortunately called Heavenly Puss.
Okay, well,
Yeah, it was a different time. But yeah, like if you go watch that short, all of the visual language from that sequence is taken from that short. Like the golden escalator, like it's that specific. The shot of Bart popping out of his body, like that's all directly from this short.
Wow.
So I thought that was interesting. I always wondered, like with The Simpsons, there is all this imagery of heaven and hell. And I was always curious, like, where does some of that come from? Because it all feels, kind of like classic cartoon stuff that you see in all sorts of cartoons of an earlier era. But this is clearly one of the inspirations, at least for this moment.
Well, and it stands to reason that, being an animated series, the animators or directors anyways would want to, much like the writers want to pay homage to the things that influence them.
Yeah.
It makes sense that the directors would likely want to pay homage to greats of animation. Whenever there's a reference to like Bugs Bunny or Tom and Jerry or even like Fleischer Studios, which did like Max Fleischer is the animator, but he did like Superman, I think Betty Boop, possibly Popeye, like
okay, yeah.
It's another one of that sort of like iconic 30s, 40s animation style that they're referencing on the show. It's always nice to see that. And again, I think that's probably where it comes from. It's not the writers pushing that, it's the directors who are pushing that. And obviously Itchy and Scratchy are very clearly an homage to like Tom and Jerry. Like
totally.
And it's something that maybe at some point we'll have to tuck into a little bit more because Itchy and Scratchy is obviously a place where they like to use film parodies, but like I'm sure that there's also references to classic Tom and Jerry shorts, and we could probably do a whole episode just on that. But
yeah, absolutely. So after that whole sequence, Bart wakes up in the hospital, and we get one of many homages to Dorothy's waking up in The Wizard of Oz, where Bart wakes up and he basically is like,
I did go away, Mom. I was miles and miles and miles away, writhing in agony in the pits of hell. And you were there. And you, and you, and you. You I've never seen before.
That's a pretty good use of the Wizard of Oz trope, I thought.
Yeah.
And a good introduction. That's your first introduction to Lionel Hutz.
I love that shot because he's got his arms around Homer and Marge. And again, it's sort of like implying that maybe this is it. They know each other. And nope, he's just there.
Yeah, he's got a kind of a crooked smile on his face.
Yeah, it's a great shot. It's such a great shot.
Yeah, because it's like, again, when this aired, as an audience member, you'd have no idea who that character was.
No, exactly.
So that's like a fun thing to think back to, because now, when I watch it, I'm like, oh, there's Lionel Hutz, you know? But
of course.
Apparently all of the courtroom scenes were very inspired by courtroom movies.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah, makes sense. But like, again, this might be actually maybe more on the animation side of like, they're trying to figure out how to mount a good courtroom climax. So they're looking at movies like The Verdict, To Kill a Mockingbird. They kind of also say like other courtroom movies very generally, but it's hard to know exactly what they were pulling from. But you can see it in just the way the lawyers, kind of pace around the room and talk to the jury and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Speaking of lawyers, this is another interesting one because I got this factoid from the commentary on a different episode, but this is the first appearance of blue-haired lawyer as Mr. Burns's legal representation. Famously, I think, his voice is based on Roy Cohn, who at the time would have been, like, I think best known for being McCarthy's lawyer. So,
yeah,
like,
the Red Scare,
Red Scare stuff. But then went on, of course, to be heavily involved with Donald Trump. So there's that. But the interesting thing is that his look is actually modeled after the actor Charles Lane, who plays maybe an assistant to Mr. Potter in It's a Wonderful Life.
Yes.
And it's his look in that movie is what inspires this lawyer. So that's kind of an interesting deep cut reference.
And it's funny, they do say the voice is modeled after Roy Cohn, and I don't really there's a really great documentary about Roy Cohn. I mean, I say great, and it's just basically discovering just the pure evil that this man was. I don't really hear it, but that has been the thing that they have said over and over and over again. But yeah, certainly Roy Cohn is, well, at that point, outside of like Johnny Cochran, is probably the most famous quote unquote celebrity lawyer. Like he was such a key figure that everybody knew. Everybody would sort of make that association. So
Right. And of course, one that like harkens back to the childhoods of like the writers and directors. You know, he was still around, but like, again, in the commentary, they point out that he was most associated with McCarthyism and all of that. So good villain lawyer. And then the last big one that I spotted was Citizen Kane, of course. The whole scene in Mr. Burns' mansion, that room, you know, this is maybe reading into it a little bit, but that room really feels like it is taking from that movie, particularly the
giant fireplace.
Exactly. It's not just a giant fireplace, it's a very horizontal fireplace, which is like a very memorable part of the design of Xanadu in that movie.
Yeah,
and I think this is the first appearance of that fireplace. It recurs.
Yeah, I mean, in our famous unaired pilot that no one will ever hear and will never see the light of day, where we talk exclusively about Citizen Kane, the Bobo episode is obviously a couple seasons later, but and they really start leaning into the Citizen Kane of it all. But yeah, like this is probably the first time we see Burns's house, so I don't know.
I don't think so, because I think even in the first season, or maybe early in season 2. There's like the whole scene where they go to the picnic at Mr. Burns'
that's true.
house,
Yeah, and I guess that's true. So yeah, but anyway, I'm sure it was, you know, again, if you're looking to model your house after a megalomaniac, like, of course you're going to go Citizen Kane because it's just iconic.
Totally. But, and like, regardless of when we first saw it, you show a location, but then you have to show different parts of a location that fit within the story. So it's like, well, okay, where are they going to have this conversation? Maybe they have it in front of a fireplace. Okay, how do we come up with the set for that scene, basically? And then you need inspiration. That's my guess of how that kind of developed.
Totally.
Okay, I do have some mystery references for you. First of all, Rashomon.
Yeah, that was what I was thinking too watching this. I was like, is this an intentional reference to Rashomon or... Right. I guess for those who are not like super familiar with Rashomon, the idea of Rashomon is that it's like a series of retellings of an event from differing perspectives, and each time it plays out slightly differently, and you know, certain characters are elevated or de-elevated as a result. So the way that Bart retells his version of events versus Burns retelling his version of events could be seen as a Rashomon-like retelling.
Construction.
But again,
maybe not.
Is it at this point, is the idea of like, you know, conflicting narratives, is that just like a trope that's established itself and it's not them actively referencing Rashomon? Maybe, because I feel like there have been other instances in the show where they've done that sort of same idea, and in the commentary they very explicitly say like, we're doing a Rashomon reference here. So
yeah, here are two things to think about. I would say Kurosawa is very underrepresented in The Simpsons in general. So that makes it a little less likely to me that it's a direct reference to Rashomon. However, one of the few people who seems to be a little bit up on Japanese cinema is Mike Reiss, who has talked about on the commentary like his love of this one Japanese short called, I think it's called Skinny and Fatty.
Okay.
He and his family like to watch. So maybe it's coming from Mike Reiss throwing in the Rashomon reference, or it could just be like, you know, it's a simple idea, right? Of just having like two different accounts. It gives them an opportunity to play with two different animation styles as part of that. So I could really see it going either way.
Again, like Rashomon comes out in like 1950, I think. And so like when this episode is coming out, it's like 40 years later. That idea of like a conflicting narrative being retold has probably established itself. And like I said, sort of become like a narrative trope that it may be a subconscious Rashomon reference, and that they're not intentionally referencing Rashomon, but in a way they are, with it, whether or not they know that they are. But
yeah, totally. Okay, here's one from the internet for you. Online, someone has claimed that the animation of Mr. Burns in his car in Bart's retelling of events is based on Cruella de Vil in 101 Dalmatians. And there certainly is. There are some driving scenes in that, and
the car is similar.
Yeah,
and so I could see there being, again, maybe not entirely intentional, but like it doesn't seem obvious enough to be like a 100% slam dunk. But I wouldn't be surprised if the animators were subconsciously referencing that, maybe.
Totally. Or taking it as like, you know, again, like they need reference material to do things that they've never done before on the show. It's very early on the show. So it's like, it's possible that they were like, oh, okay, we need a driving scene. Where could we get that? Yeah. And they kind of like are borrowing a little bit. I could see it going either way. I don't think I've seen any kind of confirmation of this one way or the other. And I even did like a sort of side by side and couldn't find a moment that felt like, oh yeah, that's clearly a reference. So interesting one.
Well, I'm just trying to do the math here. 90, because this is the other thing to keep in mind with all these Disney films is that, of course, they went in the vault and then they would get re-released. And so I'm just trying to look up when the re-release would have... Fourth re-release in 1991. So
interesting.
Maybe one of the animators went to the theater and saw it in theaters again and then was like, hey, why don't we do something like that? So
yeah, or it's being promoted again because, like, again, this came out January 10th, 1991. So it's
okay, so maybe
a little early.
It would
but
be a little
like
early.
This is something that I've been thinking about a lot more recently too. Is like some of these things that they're referencing may have been the moments from the trailers that were like in movie theaters on TV,
right? Yeah,
and were like in the popular culture even before the movie comes out. There have been a few things like that. Even like we talked about the spider, right, from Wild Wild West. I confirmed it later. It is indeed a trailer moment, right?
Right.
That was in the popular culture before the movie was even released. And so even if you didn't go see it, you might get the reference. So I could see some shenanigans like that happening with this.
Totally.
Okay, and then the last one, this is a really like tropey one. You have this scene of Burns and Smithers looking through holes in a painting at Marge and Homer while they're talking at Burns's mansion.
Totally.
That's like just one of those like tropes that's been around forever and hard to pinpoint like where it started, but could be back as far as the beginnings of cinema, could predate cinema, could be like something that happened in plays or something. I have no idea, or in novels. But that was one that I was like, where does that actually start?
I have no way to confirm this or any reason to think that this is true, but like for whatever reason, to me, it feels like a Hammer horror kind of thing.
Totally.
Like just that the vibe and everything. And it's funny. I love in the commentary, they point out how they intentionally made it so that Smithers was the dog's eyes. Like, and the painting that they're looking through is representative of the relationship between Burns and Smithers. So like, it's a great little moment, but,
totally.
Yeah, again, like, I don't know that it's a specific reference, but it's definitely a reference to a trope that has been going on for decades at that point. And I love it. Like, it is a classic sort of moment that even Sierra video games have that.
Totally.
So, yeah, I love that.
All right. Well, Adam, was there anything else in this episode that you wanted to call out or talk about?
Well, first off, we got to shout out, apparently this is the very first time Doris Stroud, the script supervisor, lends her voice to a character. And it's one of my, we've talked about how I love good line readings on this show. And her line reading of calls. Oh, calls!
Any calls, Della?
Calls. Oh, calls, yes.
It's just so good.
Perfect.
As is the animation in that moment. I love that. Actually, this is something that I didn't include as a reference because I don't think it's intended as one, but I can't help but think of it as one. When Mr. Burns is trying to crush the paper cup, and he just barely manages to do so, it made me think of the scene in Jaws where Quint, and we're going to be talking about Jaws this season, where Quint crushes a beer can, and then it cuts to Richard Dreyfuss, and, he's the more, like, nebbishy kind of guy, and he just crushes his paper cup.
Right.
So it made me think of that. And again, I don't think it's actually like an intentional reference to that moment because there's also that line of, I'll crush you like this paper cup. Like they do. Yeah, exactly. Burns and crushing paper cups has come up a couple times, but it was just a funny moment, as were all of the great when Smithers says like, but sir, think of the headlines when he's talking about firing Homer. And then they show all the different headlines and it's like,
Burns does it again.
Yeah, like all these great things about like how he thinks the news would be on his side.
Of course,
is hilarious. And then it's interesting. So the judge, this is the judge is an interesting character because he changes race multiple times throughout the series. But I thought it was worth bringing up on the commentary. They say that he is apparently a reference to Judge Bork.
Yes.
And they say this as if this is somebody that everybody would know. And I was like, who the is Judge Bork?
Yes. So did you look it up or do you know?
I didn't bother to look it up. I just I like the last name Bork because obviously Bort, and it made me think of the Swedish Chef. But
and you sometimes say the word Bork.
Yeah, I constantly will say like, this is all borked. Like I use Bork as a polite euphemism for fuck. Which, how am I going to censor that now? But the F word. There we go.
Okay, so I will tell you right off the bat, your use of borked comes from Judge Bork.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Yes. So this is like American politics and exactly the type of stuff that like the Simpsons writers love to like drop in here, kind of going back to our All the President's Men episode. Like they love to put in like this kind of deep, like political
minutia,
stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the verb to bork comes from Judge Robert Bork's failed Supreme Court nomination in 1987. So essentially he was like screwed over in the process, or so the narrative goes.
Right.
Hence the verb to bork, which the OED defines as to...
Oh, shit, it's actually in the OED.
Yeah, it's a real word. To
wow.
defame or vilify a person systematically, especially in the mass media, usually to prevent his or her appointment to a public office, and then more broadly, to obstruct or thwart a person in this way.
Interesting.
And then the tech version of this kind of arose later, probably playing off of the earlier use of it, but then also probably like a punny misspelling of broke or something like that, right? So anyway, I thought that was pretty funny, but yes, this was like, again, a big thing in popular culture at the time, fairly recent, 1987, and the word was, I think, actually coined by like a journalist talking about the situation, and was like, if nothing comes out of this, at least now we have a word for borked. Right.
There we go. That's fascinating. Okay, well, now I know. This word that I've been using all these years, I actually know the etymology of. So the only other thing I really wanted to flag was I don't really tend to watch these early episodes. Off-putting isn't the right word, but it's kind of like uncanny valley. They just don't feel like...
It's the same problem you have with the new ones, right?
Exactly.
Where it's like, it doesn't feel like The Simpsons as you think about it in your head. It's like, this is a little before that kind of came together, and the new ones are like a little after, and everything's different on that side too.
Exactly. So I'm watching it and I'm trying to figure it out. And, it's like partly it's the character models aren't quite right. And like Homer still has a little too much Walter Matthau in his voice. But what was interesting was in the commentary, Mike Reiss talks about, he says, at this point in time, we were really uncomfortable with silence in the soundtrack. And in these early seasons, he says, if you listen, there's always just sort of like a constant din of noise. Like he points out in the scene when they're having dinner at Burns' house, he's like, there's this really crappy like muzak in the background. He's like, we never do that anymore. But he says also too, like we'll add sound effects, or we'll even just add like grunts and like noises from the characters.
The sound of eating is a classic one from these seasons where you'll just constantly hear them going like,
yeah, or like they're reading something and they'll be like, and and I was like, that's totally part of what is so off-putting to me. Is just like they don't do that anymore. And even as far as like, it's interesting. I think the sound design on this show is incredible, but it's really interesting to chart the sound effects of footsteps, because in the early seasons, a lot of the characters actually do have them, and then you'll notice that they start to really lessen them off, and it's really... Marge has a distinct sort of like heel sound effect, and Lisa has a very distinct sound effect for her footsteps. All of them kind of go away except for Lisa. Like Lisa's footsteps sort of stay consistent, and like they tend to use them consistently even into like later in the season. Like now that I've pointed it out, Nate, pay attention and you'll totally notice what I'm talking about. But yeah, it's just, that was something that jumped out at me that like I couldn't put my finger on what was bothering me, and then like Reiss called this out, and I was like, 100% that's one of the things that is really driving me nuts watching these early seasons. Is just like the way they handle sound.
Yeah, like filmmaking and TV making it's a gestalt thing, right? So it's like it's about how it all comes together, but even a little detail like the sound of Lisa's feet or like eating sounds at the dinner table can like contribute to your overall feeling of it feeling right or feeling off or all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Love that. Yeah, I mean, the only other thing that I really wanted to hit was just this ending, which is so weird and feels like a James L. Brooks note, right?
Well, apparently it was. Like, I read somewhere, or maybe it was in the commentary, they basically said, like, Brooks came in and rewrote the ending, or told them they had to rewrite the ending.
Yeah.
Like, he didn't like the ending as originally scripted and felt that it needed a more softened...
emotional beat.
Yeah. That, as you say, feels a little unearned and a little too, as Homer would say, wrapped up in a neat little package.
Right. Because like there have been basically no emotional stakes for like the first 2/3 of this episode.
Yeah.
And then suddenly Homer goes from like just being kind of like greedy and wanting money to being like, now I'm always going to associate your face with like losing my one big shot, which like also feels really petty and out of character for Homer. Because, usually the relationship between Homer and Marge is like pretty rock solid in a lot of ways.
I mean, I love
it's a
how
big
she
deal
says,
if this happens. You know?
Yeah, well, and I love how she says, we squabbled over money before. I mean, except for maybe that one time I put the $20 bill through the wash or whatever the line
Right.
is. But like, and it's true, like money problems has been at the heart of conflict on this show many, many times. But
yeah,
for him to go from like 0 to 100, it feels unearned. And I think maybe all it is that like having those emotional stakes peppered throughout the first and second act, like had they gone back and rewritten it to sort of feel cohesive or
right, because like you know, some of the other episodes, like we've talked about the one where Homer becomes a prank monkey, right?
Yes,
it's like that episode starts with like a whole beat about their money problems basically. And as flawed as that episode is in certain ways, like it actually kind of gets the emotional part right of like Homer wanting to provide for his family and so on and so on. And that's not really the beginning of this, because this is a Bart story that then ends up being like a Marge and Homer story in a weird way.
I think what also bothers me is that like Marge would call him out on this. Like she does this whole thing of like, he says, I don't think I will love you anymore. And she's like, I won't wait another minute until I know. And it's like, later on in the season, she would be like, well, this is ridiculous, Homer. Like she wouldn't accept that. And
she also comes into the bar apologizing for doing the right thing.
Yeah, it's just like, I don't know.
Funny, but
it doesn't... maybe it's my love of Marge and her character and how she's sort of like the one moral high ground in this show. Well, I guess Lisa is too, but like her behavior just feels out of character.
Yeah, and it's the same for Homer. It's like it doesn't quite feel right to their relationship, I think, is the root of what bugs me about it.
Yeah. So I'm with you. The ending doesn't work for me.
But let's end on a high note. This is my favorite line from this whole episode. And it's an exchange between Lionel Hutz and Dr. Nick Riviera, who also, I think,
it's his first appearance.
His first appearance, and I think you could also actually argue that his character comes out of the homage to this movie as well. There is a similar character that appears very briefly
a little bit
in this movie, a kind of quack doctor that helps them like numb up Lemmon's arm.
Well, specifically, he's a dentist.
Yeah, that's right. He's a dentist, or is he a veterinarian? But yeah, I think that you could argue that Nick Riviera partly comes out of that same story role of like, well, if it's medical fraud, you need a quack medical doctor, right? But anyways, so basically Marge is like expressing her concern, and Lionel Hutz goes, with all due respect, Mrs. Simpson, you're not a doctor. The boy's not a doctor. I'm not a doctor. The only person in this room who even comes close is this man. And Dr. Nick goes, stop, you're embarrassing me.
Ooh, that's a very good Dr. Nick name.
Thanks. That's
Otto and Dr. Nick. Those are your two.
That's right. Yeah, I can do a very good bad Ricky Ricardo impression.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, exactly. Well, so can Hank Azaria. So
yeah, exactly.
There were some great lines in this and some great laugh out loud moments that I wasn't expecting. And again, it's kind of fun to go back and watch these older episodes because they're much like you talked about with the Treehouse of Horrors. Because I'm less familiar with them, the jokes are a little less played out for me, but. Yeah, on the whole, this is not Criterion Collection material. I would not place this in my ever-growing top 5, top 10. But still an enjoyable watch. So
yeah, again, I always enjoy the moments of invention in these early seasons and kind of like seeing the origins of this idea or this style or all that kind of stuff. But yeah, probably not my top tier even for this season.
Totally. Well, let's dig into the movie. Shall we?
Let's do it.
Nate, how would you sum this movie up in a sentence?
A shyster lawyer convinces his brother-in-law to commit medical fraud and hijinks ensue.
Sure, yeah. I think that's basically the underlying premise. As we alluded to, what The Simpsons is borrowing from this film is this idea of someone gets injured, a shyster lawyer. Should we be saying shyster? I feel like this is
I looked it up.
It's not a slur. Okay.
It's
good.
not.
Thank you.
There have been claims that it is a slur, but upon looking it up, there appears to be no evidence that it is.
Okay.
A reference to Shylock is the concern that it's like a reference to that character in The Merchant of Venice, but it appears to not be. So
okay. Yeah. Well, anyway, a less than on the up and up lawyer convinces someone to commit, as you said, medical fraud, and the added element here is that The reason that the brother-in-law, Jack Lemmon's character, is willing to commit the fraud is he's less interested in the money and he's more interested in getting his ex-wife back.
Right.
And Walter Matthau convinces him, well, if you do this, like she'll take you back. And
Right.
it's a terrible Walter Matthau impression. I don't know what that was, but anyway, we found a plot synopsis from the 1991 Laserdisc. I have to say, I'm surprised this would have gotten a Laserdisc release.
It's true. Yeah.
But deluxe letterboxed edition. Wow. So this is like a nice Laserdisc too.
Well, I don't know if we've really talked about this, but it's a Billy Wilder movie. So
yeah, I guess that's true.
Probably every Billy Wilder movie got this treatment or something close to it because it's just, he's a classic filmmaker,
Though I would say probably a lesser of the Wilder pantheon. But
Yes,
anyway,
definitely.
this is the description that comes from that Laserdisc. When TV cameraman Harry Hinkle, Jack Lemmon, is tackled by a player at a football game, shyster lawyer Whiplash Willie Gingrich, Walter Matthau, decides to sue everybody, CBS TV, the Cleveland Browns, Municipal Stadium, for $1 million. Harry says that's dishonest. He's not hurt. But when Willie points out that Harry's beautiful wife, who ran off with a musician, may return if Harry has all that money, he sees the light. From here, it's a neck brace, a wheelchair, and a private detective recording Harry's every move, or lack of it, from an adjacent apartment. The fortune cookie boasts snappy dialogue and outrageous gags as only this clever quartet can deliver them. Lemmon and Matthau in their first film together, Wilder and I.A.L. Diamond writing their 7th.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Yeah. I think that's a pretty good description overall.
Yeah, I think so.
Captures the key elements.
I snappy dialogue is maybe not how I would describe it, but we'll get into that. So, Nate, what's your background with this film?
I mean, basically nothing.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I've never seen this. Only knew about this movie, even the existence of this movie, from The Simpsons.
Right.
Basically. The other sort of like vectors that you could kind of know about this movie would be Lemmon and Matthau and Billy Wilder. So my background on Lemmon and Matthau is also very limited, I would say. I don't think I've seen any of their other team-up movies.
Oh, okay.
Which is wild, because it's like even when we were kids, it's like you had Grumpy Old Men, you know? They've been doing this for a long time.
They're the original Odd Couple. Yeah, no,
Right. Which, by the way, they're the original Odd Couple thing is a joke that they make on The Simpsons like 20 times.
Oh, it's so good. I mean, my favorite one is when Homer sings the Odd Couple theme when he when he forces Lisa and Bart to share a bedroom, and his singing of the Odd Couple theme is iconic, and I love it, and it still makes me laugh today.
So meet your comically mismatched roommate, Bart Simpson. Biddy, biddy, biddy.
I'm gonna make your life a living hell.
That's probably my favorite Odd Couple reference, but I think they it's funny because they do it in this half-hearted way that I think they know it's a corny thing that people say all the time.
Yes.
And so they're kind of referencing that rather than actually making the joke.
Yeah.
Anyway, I haven't seen The Odd Couple. I haven't seen Grumpy Old Men. I haven't seen the other ones that are kind of like maybe not as well known. Those are probably the two big ones that have really endured. So yeah, that's a bit of a blind spot. Billy Wilder, I have definitely seen many of his movies, I would say.
Okay, that's what I was curious about, is like if you were familiar with Wilder's work.
Yes, but I would say I like his noir more than his comedies, which is like, just probably reflective of my broader taste in general anyways.
Yes. I mean, like, you've been a film noir fan for basically as long as I've known you.
Yeah.
You got me into that, so I'm not surprised that would be more up your alley.
Right. I like Double Indemnity. I love Sunset Boulevard. I think it's my favorite Wilder that I've seen, and it's because it kind of balances the two tones really nicely.
Yeah, totally.
Because it's like, it's both a great noir, but it's also pretty funny. And like has this camp element that's really compelling. So yeah, that's kind of my background with this movie. But what about you? Do you have any connections?
No, kind of similar to you. Like, I think, unsurprisingly, was aware of the Matthau-Lemmon relationship via the AFI specials. I also have not seen The Odd Couple. No, shocker. I also have not seen The Odd Couple, but like,
interesting.
I feel like it's just like it's kind of permeated via pop culture. Like, I'm aware of it so much. I watched a couple episodes of the TV series over the years, and I actually watched like the pilot of the I'm sorry, with all due respect, rest in peace, Matthew Perry, but the dreadful Matthew Perry reboot from a couple years ago, borderline unwatchable, but okay, sure, like make that bank. I love that guy, and I'm glad he was making money, but that was very ill-advised on all parts. But it's in your notes, you said that like with Matthau, the thing that you knew him from was Dennis the Menace, which 100% it was my introduction to him, was that Dennis the Menace
So
movie,
weird.
which is so weird. You know who else is in that movie? And for the longest time, I couldn't figure out what I knew them from, and then I made the connection.
Who is it?
So, well, actually, two people. Natasha Lyonne is the first
my
one.
God, Natasha Lyonne.
She's the shitty babysitter.
Amazing.
Who they hire, and then like she gets her boyfriend to come over or whatever. Yeah, like it's one of her earliest roles, and I just remember as a kid being like, why does this lady have like a husky New York accent? But that's how Natasha Lyonne speaks. Yeah, so that's one of her first appearance. It might actually be like her first film role.
Because I think she's in the American Pie movies, right?
Yes. Well, she's in American Pie 2.
Okay.
And Scary Movie 2. No, so Dennis the Menace was her fourth on-screen appearance, but like it looks like her first couple ones maybe were minor roles. So... Well, she was in a movie called A Man Called Sarge in the role of Arab girl. So,
that's a good sign.
Yeah. Maybe not going to check that film out. But yes. Anyway, and then the other person who is in that movie that this would have been the first movie I saw him in was Christopher Lloyd.
Oh. Interesting that was your introduction to Christopher Lloyd.
But he's Switchblade Sam. He's like the villain of Dennis the Menace.
Fascinating.
So, yeah, because
I feel like we need to watch that movie and do the episode Two Bad Neighbors.
I think we should, because like this was one of those movies that like I grew up on. We had it on VHS. I watched it a ton. So yeah, maybe we will have to cover it.
I know it's not. They're not referencing the movie, and they're not referencing any specific Dennis the Menace thing. It's just the Dennis the Menace dynamic between Bart and President
Well, now
Bush.
that I knew, yeah. Anyway, all that's to say that was my introduction to Matthau. And then in terms of Billy Wilder, yes, I've seen like the best of. I was a huge fan of Some Like It Hot as a little kid because I was a weird kid.
Sure. That checks out.
Yeah, and then later saw Sunset Boulevard. I mean, again, I saw Some Like It Hot because my dad and my grandfather loved it and they introduced me to it at an early age. And then, yeah, Sunset Boulevard saw probably in high school and was like, this movie's a masterpiece.
Yeah.
But it was also like, I knew it because of that iconic shot of Gloria Swanson coming down the stairs. I'm ready for my close-up. Like,
yes.
That was just like embedded in every sort of like film retrospective montage. Like, they use that all the time. That's another movie that I feel like we should cover because, like, for being such a classic, I feel like it's not necessarily as well known amongst our generation. And, like, I've talked to other people where I'm like, oh, Sunset Boulevard. And they're like, what's that? And I'm like, oh, you have to see. And obviously it's very hot right now because it's got the Broadway musical has been remounted.
But never been parodied on The Simpsons.
Seriously?
There's like a moment that's super arguable, which is like, I think they're at a motel and there's a body in the pool.
Yeah, the body floating in the pool, which is the
I think that's
shot.
that's a pretty weak connection. And other than that, I don't think it is. I'm stepping on my take later, but this is the movie I want them to parody.
Okay, fair enough. But I'm surprised they never even would do the shot of. Interesting. Okay, well there we go.
Fascinating.
All this to say, because if it hasn't been parodied on The Simpsons, we may not get to talk about it. But everybody should go rent Sunset Boulevard this weekend.
Love it.
It's so good. I haven't watched it in years. I should rewatch it because it's a masterpiece. Okay, Nate, how did this movie come to exist?
Yeah, so because this movie it kind of doesn't exist, it's hard to find a background on it. You know, my usual go-to is like the AFI catalog of films, which has great background on all these things, and it's all cited, so you actually know that it's real. There isn't very much about this movie on there. And so what I will say instead is kind of what the back of the box said, which is like, this is in the middle of a bunch of pairings of the same groups of people, right? And so it's like, really what you need to know is like Wilder is a prolific filmmaker who had like his group of people that he liked to work with. And this is another movie where he's doing that. So this is the 7th of 12 team ups between Wilder and I.A.L. Diamond writing this movie. It's the 4th of 7 team ups between Wilder and Lemmon, including like Some Like It Hot and stuff like that. Right.
I didn't realize he did that many with Lemmon. Wow. That's crazy.
Yeah. And then the other sort of piece of context to know is that, like, they are coming off of kind of a bomb. So the last movie that Wilder did is Kiss Me Stupid, which definitely sounds made up, but apparently was not very successful. So he really wanted to make a movie that was going to be successful.
Right.
So you could look at this as, depending on how you think about it, you could look at this as like kind of a safe bet movie of being like, okay, it's sort of straight down the middle. Walter and Matthau are not a sure thing right now, but like he clearly saw that there could be this sort of dynamic, almost like a screwball comedy dynamic, even though it's not a romance between them. But it's got a bit of that energy of like the mismatch, the odd couple energy, right?
Yeah. Well, they're the original odd couple.
Bitty, bitty, bitty.
Right, yeah. Before there even was an odd couple. Although, interestingly, Matthau was already playing the odd couple on stage.
Yes, and that was the one piece of background that I was able to sort of like read about, was that Wilder saw Matthau on stage and really wanted to give him a movie role. And the studio was like, we don't want to do that. And Wilder
Lemmon was like, I have other ideas about who I want in this role.
And Wilder was like, it's him or we're not doing the picture. And so, which is really kind of interesting that like Wilder saw something there, and obviously like it just sort of speaks to his genius that he knew like, no, there's something here and this is gonna work. So
you can really kind of thank Wilder for the pairing, which is really interesting. It's not like they were buddies off screen before this happened.
Yeah.
And then the other, this is like pretty basic, but like in terms of the nugget of the story, Wilder was a big sports fan, and apparently one time he was watching TV and someone got hit on the sidelines, and he was like, that would be a good idea for a story. And that's pretty much where the story comes from.
I mean, it's that classic era of like cinema where, you could just take a little nugget and that would, I mean, I feel like that's now more common in like TV and like certainly the Simpsons writer talk about that sort of thing. But like, you could take a little nugget and you could make a nice cheap little comedy and
Bob's your uncle.
Bob's your uncle, and hopefully you make back your investment, which is a perfect segue to say, Nate, this movie doesn't really exist, so how was it received? How did it do? Like, is that just because it's an old movie and we've sort of forgotten and it's been lost to time, or was it just not particularly successful?
I think it was, moderately successful, which it does totally reflect my vibes with this movie generally, is that like, it is a fine movie. It's well crafted. Critics were sort of like, yeah, it's fine. The performances, that was like the thing that really stood out, right?
Right.
And particularly the dynamic between Lemmon and Matthau, shocker.
Yeah.
So that was the thing that everyone latched onto. In terms of box office, like it really is straight down the middle. The budget was $3.7 million. It made $6 million. So, didn't quite double its money, but like did okay. But Adam, where do you think it fell in terms of the top grossing movies of the year?
At $6 million, I can't imagine it even cracked the top 10. Like, or if it did, it would be like number 10. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah. It was 21st.
Yeah. Okay. That tracks. Yeah. Like 6 million, even by 1960 standards, is not great. So
yeah. But Adam, can you think of what the top movies of 1966 might be to give us some context here?
Okay, 1966 is Thunderball. No, they were making James Bond movies like every year that year. So that it might be. Is there a Bond movie in the top 10?
No, there is not.
Yeah, no, because I think Thunderball is maybe the year before, and then You Only Live Twice is the year after or something. Like, again, this period is sort of like a blind spot for me, so I have no idea. I have to imagine there's probably, based on our conversation from Ben-Hur, there's going to be like a Sword and Sandals movie.
Yes.
There's going to be some sort of like stage adaptation movie.
Yes.
There's going to be possibly a romantic comedy.
Kind of.
Yeah, I don't know, but what's top 10?
Okay, so this is pretty interesting. I would say there's one on here that gets like a pretty good, solid Simpsons parody.
Okay.
And a couple others that have references. So we have The Bible is number one.
Oh, there's our Sword and Sandals movie.
There's our Sword and Sandals. Drafting off of Ben-Hur, probably.
Yeah, probably.
But I mean, like, these movies always did well. Like,
yes.
Because you just have this Christian audience that wants entertainment, but also wants to be coddled a little bit from a moral standpoint. Like, no sex, no scandal.
But we'll do it on an epic scale. And exactly.
Yep. Hawaii.
Okay.
I believe that is also kind of in that same type of movie.
Right.
P.S. When you Google Hawaii, the state of Hawaii comes up.
Oh, shocker.
So
not a great film title.
Yeah, so the poster for Hawaii is absolutely a ripoff of Ben-Hur. So
interesting.
there you go. You have the big monumental text, right?
Yeah.
That is
I'm looking at it now. Yeah, you're totally... Oh, but it's a George Roy Hill joint. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. Number 3, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? Now, this is the one.
Yeah,
Queen of the Hoppies.
Yeah,
this is the one that does get a Simpsons reference a few times.
Yeah.
And I actually wonder if there's more than we even know. You know, there are a lot of scenes on The Simpsons where someone comes home and someone else is sitting in the dark waiting for them.
Yes.
And I think that is from this movie, but I'm not 100% sure because I haven't seen it in a long time. So, The Sand Pebbles, a movie I have never heard of. A Man for All Seasons, so parodied in A Star is Burns. You have A Burns for All Seasons. Lieutenant Robin Crusoe USN, a movie I don't know, but I'm guessing, you know, Robinson Crusoe is probably the reference there. The Russians Are Coming, The Russians Are Coming.
Okay, War Picture. Yeah, I should have mentioned, there's going to be a War Picture,
Yeah, and that one's kind of a comedy, right? Or
yeah, I'm pretty sure it is.
And then you have...
Oh, yeah. And it's a Norman Jewison movie, so like...
Oh, Norman Jewison did so many like weird, random things. It's great.
The weirdest career, the nicest man. I met him, and I have to tell you, he is quite literally, of all the quote unquote celebrities I've met, he has to be among the nice. He's Canadian. One of the nicest gentlemen. May he rest in peace. But the weirdest career.
And I like a lot of his movies.
Oh, me too.
But they are just like they swing
They're
in
all
totally
over
different
the
directions.
place. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, Grand Prix, which I have to imagine is a racing movie.
Yeah, like a very, very famous racing movie.
Okay.
Which, again, I haven't seen it. Famous for its, like, editing, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. The Professionals.
Okay.
Which, I don't know. I guess it's a Western by the looks of it.
Yeah, it looks like it. Richard Brooks, yeah. Okay, with Burt Lancaster and Lee Marvin. So, yeah, I would say it's probably a Western.
Our friend Lee.
Yeah.
And then number 10, we have Alfie.
Okay, so yeah, there you go, rom-com, yeah. Okay.
Yep.
The original Alfie, with Michael Caine. Okay, so yeah, this doesn't really fit in.
Yeah, this is almost. Yeah. It's hard to put myself in the shoes of viewers at this time, but looking at this list, I have to feel like this movie feels old-fashioned.
Yeah,
You know?
even the fact that it's in black and white.
Right.
Part of me wonders if, again, when you have a prolific filmmaker like Billy Wilder, a movie like this for the average filmmaker is probably like in their upper echelon. But when you make Sunset Boulevard and you make Some Like It Hot and you make Double Indemnity and you make The Apartment, this isn't going to crack, the top 5 of their filmography. There are filmmakers like that today that it's just like they've made so many films that the lesser films are oft overlooked. Not necessarily because they're bad, they're just not on par with their best.
Yeah.
So,
well, I do feel like all of these are, a lot of them are kind of like, well, how do we set ourselves apart from television? And this is something that could live on television in a lot of ways.
Maybe it's better suited for television. Not to spoil my take on this movie, but it's not. I didn't think it was very cinematic. Despite its scope, cinematography. Anyway, we're going to get into it. And let's get into it. Let's start with the place where we like to always start, the cast and characters. Nate, what did you think of the young Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau?
I mean, this is kind of a trick question. It's like, well, they're one of cinema's most recognizable duos, especially, I would say, like, of this era. You have duos earlier than this, but like they kind of dominate for a while, I feel like. And there's a reason.
For like through like multiple decades worth.
Totally. So it's like the two leads are fantastic. They're already getting into what their personas that they're sort of known for. Jack Lemmon is nervous and well-meaning, I
have to say, I have always liked Jack Lemmon.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert, didn't particularly love this movie, but I think Lemon's so good in it. Like he's anytime he's on screen, I love his persona. Yep. And one of my notes was like, I know that Glenn Ross is what gives us Gil, but like he's giving a lot of Gil energy in this. Like a lot of that sort of like, woe is me, like something about the way he delivers his dialogue is just like inherently funny. Yeah. And I think he leaps off the screen in this.
Yeah, and I think you could say the same thing about Matthau, for me at least.
Yeah.
In the sense that, like, he is... I don't want to say their performances are big, necessarily. That has sort of a negative connotation, but their performances are very physical, I would say.
Yes.
They both kind of have rubber faces. They both really carry their characters in their posture and that kind of thing.
Totally.
Like, you know, I mean, Matthau is always sort of slouching and in your face and scowling and that kind of stuff. And then Jack Lemmon is, like you said, he's kind of popping, right? Like he just is so big and changes pretty radically scene to scene. It's fun to watch. Like, you can understand why people looked at this and were like, movie's okay, but like, wow, these two, you know, really stand out and we should do more with them, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. For those who don't have the context, like Lemmon he's an Oscar winner at this point, right? Like, he's pretty well established for his on-screen performances. And as we sort of alluded to earlier, like Matthau is the one who's coming into this as sort of like, underdog is not the right term, but like he's not Walter Matthau, essentially.
No, totally. I mean, this is his breakout role, I think. Right. And the one that gives him a star persona. And in fact, I mean, he wins the Oscar for actor in a best supporting role.
For this movie?
For this.
Wow. I didn't realize that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
So it's like that really is what kicks off his career big time. I think before that, he had kind of smaller roles. He was in a movie called A Face in the Crowd. He's in Charade.
Yes.
And he's in Failsafe.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, he's actually we've talked about on this
He's
podcast.
pretty good in Charade. And then, of course, I think, like, for a certain generation, like, Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3, Bad News Bears, like, those are sort of classics of 70s cinema. And then, obviously, in the 90s, he does Dennis the Menace.
Yeah. Well, the Bad News Bears is kind of, like, already tipping its hat towards that as well, I would say. And I feel like I did see that movie as well as a kid, and probably... that was another early influence on the way I saw Walter Matthau.
But to me, it's really interesting that he won an Academy Award because, like, I don't dislike his performance in this, but I wouldn't say I found it memorable or I didn't find it, like, awards worthy.
Interesting.
There's obviously something there because, like we said, he sort of goes on to have this incredible career. Yeah. Obviously, he resonated more with you than he did with me, too, so...
Yeah, I mean, like, it's so unusual to have a comedic performance recognized at the Oscars like this.
Yeah.
And this performance does not have, like, the emotional depth that you would expect from that kind of recognition. And again, not to denigrate the performance. I loved it, but it is such an unusual pick, I would say, overall. Maybe it was different at that time, but I don't feel like it really was. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf came out the same year.
Well, that's what I mean.
And you think about the acting in that movie versus the acting in this movie, and it's like two completely different philosophies. I think, like, I've been listening to this podcast, The Rewatchables, a lot recently. It's a great podcast about movies that you like to rewatch, right? And I think that's the thing about Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon is, like, they make you want to rewatch their movies because their performances are fun to watch. You know? And, you know, again, I don't know if I'm going to go back and rewatch this one a bunch of times, but, like, I can see why people got kind of addicted to their personalities and the way they show up on screen and, you know, the cock of their eyebrow and the slouch and, like, all that stuff that just is so iconic, I guess.
Yeah. I do want to shout out Lemmon's physicality in this movie because one of the gags, the visual gags, is that after he agrees that he's going to, you know, go along with this plot, he ends up in like they refer to it as a corset, but it's basically like a back brace and neck brace.
Yeah.
And he's, you know, confined to his bed. So you would think, oh, there's not a lot of opportunity here for a big physical performance. And yet he uses that restriction in a really unique way to still deliver a surprisingly physical performance despite its limitations, which that just goes to show what an incredible performer he is. I guess what I'm getting at is that, like, of the two, I would be giving Lemmon an Oscar, not necessarily Matthau, because I think Lemmon's performance is the more impressive performance in the film. I just couldn't get over how he's able to do so much with so little, and I think it just speaks to what an incredibly talented performer Lemmon really is.
Totally. So here's my defense, I guess, of Walter Matthau would be the tricky thing in this role is that this is a guy who is doing something unethical that he knows is unethical, and you have to kind of root for him. And so I feel like he manages to strike a balance in this role that's pretty interesting of being shady, underhanded, sometimes like downright mean. We'll talk about Boom Boom Jackson shortly, but he's quite mean to that character throughout the movie. He manages to kind of get you on his side. And I think it's partly because the character's written to be smart, unlike Lionel Hutz.
Yes.
He's like, he shows up into the offices of the competing lawyers who are trying to foil his plan. And like, he knows all the precedents for this case, and he's able to argue his point very well. He
100%.
knows how to fool them and get them to settle and all this sort of stuff. And so you're kind of maybe a little impressed by the character. And he's quite like funny and clever. And so even though he's mean and he's doing something wrong, he's able to take you along for the ride. And it's partly the writing, but I do think it's also partly Matthau's performance.
Well, like you said, he's shady, but he's not evil.
Right.
And I think that's a really fine balance when you're doing a sort of like crooked lawyer character.
Yeah.
To find
and he's persuasive about his point of like, well, you know, like, who cares about these companies? Like, whatever, you know, they got all the money in the world. That like, it'll be fine, you know? He kind of makes the case that it's a victimless crime, which this movie, I think, has a very strong opinion that it is not a victimless crime, which is interesting.
Yes. That is probably the moral center of the film.
Yes.
Well, you alluded to him. Let's talk a little bit about Boom Boom Jackson.
Yeah.
A character that...
I already can feel the vibes coming off of you. Go on.
Yeah? No, you go on, sir. I don't know, man. Like, it's just, it felt so... Look, okay. I'm going to jump to my biggest complaint with this movie in general is that it is too goddamn long. There is no reason for this movie to be 2 hours long. And I think, ultimately, it works better as a sitcom premise than it does as a premise for an entire film. But because it's a film, we need to flesh out a bunch more characters. And so we have to have the Boom Boom character that, like, doesn't really go anywhere until the final scene, where it's just like, well, this final scene feels like it's tacked on to justify why you keep having him throughout the rest of the film. I don't know. Like, I get that part of it.
I disagree with that, but that's interesting. Okay.
I get that part of it is meant to be his generosity is what Harry ultimately starts to struggle with, and that's what forces him to sort of like eventually realize the errors of his ways.
Yeah.
But I don't think that was necessary ultimately. I think you could have gotten there without doing that. Or maybe it's a matter of like you needed to flesh out Boom Boom more and then like not have the wife. I don't know. I think it's just, there's too much going on to fully do justice to this character or the wife character.
Yeah.
And it suffers as a result.
That's fair. I like this character. I have a different opinion about how it fits into the story. But I think Ron Rich's performance is the problem, in my opinion.
And that is maybe part of it, too.
You know, this is his debut film. He did not do a lot else. He did a few bit parts on TV after this. He did, however, write a very interesting looking movie called Ghost Fever, which appears to be... which appears to be a ripoff of Ghostbusters.
Oh, with Sherman Hemsley.
Yeah. Yes. Which I'm like, maybe I do actually want to see this.
Yeah.
Also, note that the house in the background of this poster is almost exactly like the murder house on The Simpsons.
Yes.
And, you know, it's kind of like a mashup of other scary movie houses. Anyway.
Well, Nate, also note that this film was directed by Alan Smithy, which is the famous, I'm removing my name from this movie because it was that bad. So, like, that tells you everything you need to know.
Yes. So all that to say, like, this guy did not necessarily go on to do a lot of other big, meaty acting roles, especially on film.
Right.
And I think he's doing an okay job, but I think also, like, in the hands of a different actor, I think this role could actually be really touching and, like, provide an interesting foil for the story. Because I think, like, at the end of the day, the story is about Harry's struggle to do the right thing.
Yes.
And I think the character of Boom Boom Jackson, who we should say is, he's the football player who hits Harry at the beginning of the movie and mildly injures him, but gives his brother-in-law an excuse to basically start this medical fraud case. And throughout the movie, Boom Boom Jackson is like the nicest guy, right? He's showing up to the hospital with flowers. He moves in basically with the Lemmon character to help him recover, even though he doesn't need to recover, but Boom Boom Jackson doesn't know that. Yeah. But he's cooking him dinner. He's helping him learn how to walk again. He is like there the whole time trying to do the right thing. And
But I guess, again, part of my issue is that, like, he's comically nice.
Yes.
But it's never played as a gag. It's played too sincerely, but it's like, this is too ridiculous to be realistic.
Yes.
And so there's that dichotomy of, like, they should almost be playing it up. And then there's also the subplot of, like, I can't even really remember what the subplot is, but like he goes to a bar and he gets in a bar fight and there's
So I think there's a couple things going on here. I'm going to wade into some territory here that I don't know that much about, but I'm going to raise some questions. So I wonder if part of the way this character is characterized is because he is black.
Right.
And I think at this point in time, it is probably critical that you make this character above reproach in terms of making this movie resonate with a white audience, right?
Right.
And so I think that is why he is perfect, essentially. He's presented as perfect. For example, Sidney Poitier has talked about the pressure he felt to play these roles where he is perfect. He has no moral weakness or anything like that, because it was the only way that he could get the respect as particularly as a leading man, but I think, in general, and not be like pigeonholed into roles that were either just outright racist or were just not the types of roles he wanted to play.
Right.
And so I do think that might be part of what's going on here, is that he's written as a flatly perfect character so that, presumably racist white audiences are going to like this character.
Yeah.
But I do think there's some interesting commentaries on race in this movie, too, that are a little below the surface. There's one big one at the end, which is a very clear textual sort of racist thing, which we'll talk about. But even the Lemmon character, there are some moments where he's interacting with Boom Boom when he's taking care of him in the apartment, where Lemmon makes a sort of casually racist comment.
Right.
And then Jackson comes back without any kind of sourness and surprises him with something very worldly. So, like, for example, Harry says, "Oh, are you making fried chicken for dinner?" Right? Which is a pretty racist thing. And he's basically like, "No, I'm making this like Portuguese dish that's like a different kind of chicken." And and then he tells a story about like his mother, and so it's like, I think Wilder and Diamond are trying to give depth to the character and sort of saying like, this surface level thing that Lemmon is putting out there is not only not true, but there's actually a whole backstory that is about the complexity of who this person is. So I think all that's going on, and I still don't think it really works.
Well, that's
the bottom line.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's ultimately where I fall. I think this is a good segue to talk about the story and the tone of this film. As I said, I think it works as a sitcom premise, and obviously The Simpsons thought so as well.
Yeah, and when you say that, just to be clear, you mean like a one-off episode, not like a premise for an ongoing sitcom.
Well, I mean, you could. Ironically, you could do it as maybe only for a season, but...
Right. But you could at the end of each season, you could just add another complication that stretches it out further.
That's true.
And it would be pretty funny, actually.
If you had the right writing staff, you could actually do this as its own sitcom. But what I'm saying is as a one-off for a quirky, again, and very much like a 60s or 70s sitcom, where they were just every week they were getting up to crazy hijinks. But I think this film is overly stuffed. It doesn't justify its runtime. It's trying to do too much. Like, ultimately, like, again, Lemmon has to grapple with doing the right thing.
Right.
And his motivation for not doing the right thing is his wife. And then his motivation for ultimately doing the right thing is the generosity and kindness of Boom Boom.
Well, and the fact that they screw over Boom Boom. Like, that's why the bar fight matters, is that Boom Boom essentially loses his job on this football team because he's so racked with guilt that he's not performing well, and then he gets in a fight at this bar that basically is the last straw. And so it's not a victimless crime. So that's part of why the character has to exist, is because you need someone to reflect the repercussions of what's happening.
But again, all of that stuff happens off screen. Like, that's I think that's part of my problem. It's just like Boom Boom just sort of like appears, and then you're given like, oh, this has happened. It's like, if you were doing this properly, and I'm not saying I'm a better writer than Billy Wilder, because I'm not. Let's be clear. I'm a terrible writer. But like, that character should have been more fleshed out, and we should have seen more of his career and his life to understand, so that everything sort of dovetails and comes back around at the end.
Yeah.
But we don't get that. And then there's the wife character. We're getting little glimpses of her, and then basically only shows up for the third act. But like, and she figures out that this is all a scam. And so she's kind of like scamming him because she wants the money. It doesn't work for me. There's just too much going on. And then all the while you've got Walter Matthau trying to do other scams and like going to the insurance company. And then the insurance company is kind of a character because it's like, we're going to try and... And that leads us to the private investigation situations, which leads to some of the best physical comedy in the film.
Yes.
But like also just like, we're doing this now? We're spending time on this character that is complete... Like, it's just... It's trying to do way too much. I feel like it needed to be tightened up. Yeah. Like, if this were a nice, tight 90 minutes and you were able to, like, get to the heart of what they're trying to say... Yeah. Which, like, ultimately, I'm not really sure what they're trying to say here.
Yeah. So, a couple things. One of the things that ties the story together for me, or one of my theories about it, I guess, is that, like, at the end of the day... Jack Lemmon's motivation is that he's lonely.
Yeah.
And he doesn't feel like he has people in his life that he can trust and like rely on, I guess. And that's the weakness that allows him to be taken advantage of by his brother-in-law. I think that's part of it. That's what he's looking for in his wife, or his ex-wife. And it turns out she's as bad as Matthau, basically. And that's what he finds at the end with Boom Boom. He kind of realizes that he'd been seeking his relationships, his like support in the wrong places.
Yeah.
And then embraces this other person who actually, at the end of the day, represents the kind of person that he wants to be. That's kind of why that ending matters. I think that part works for me. I agree that it's too long overall. I agree that it's also trying to do too much. And I think that even despite that, it actually feels like a pretty small movie. Yes. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And so this is one thing that I was wondering. One of the big changes that The Simpsons makes is that their version ends in a courtroom scene. And I feel like that is a more natural progression of this storyline than what happens. Their escalation is basically like there's private eyes watching them from across the street, so they have to like keep the charade up as they're under investigation. But it's like it feels very small and contained, and that may just be like a budget thing of like, well, then you don't need to pay all these extras to be in the courtroom, and you don't need to have another set and all that kind of stuff. It's just an apartment. But it does feel a little unsatisfying to me at the end of the day. And I'm wondering if you think this movie would be better with a courtroom climax.
Well, what I would say to that is I think more what it suffers from is that Matthau never gets his comeuppance.
Right. Yeah.
On the contrary, and I will say I do really like that final sequence where Lemmon sort of basically reveals that this is a fraud. Yep. And the private eye, they've bugged the apartment and they've been filming and it's revealed, I don't think that we got the reveal. And Lemmon, who's a cameraman, picks up the microphone and says to the guy rolling the camera across the hallway, like,
"What's your exposure?" "I was wide open." "Stop it down to F4. Check your focus."
And he literally just does the whole thing over again. And like, it's a great sort of physical performance from Lemmon. It's a really funny moment.
That moment's great.
So he's now revealed that he's a fraud and he doesn't care. He's doing the right thing, as it were. And then Matthau is sort of like, they're like, well, now you're cooked, you're not getting your money. And he's like, oh yeah, well you bugged the apartment and this is illegal under the bubble. Like,
he basically like records his own defense using one of the bugs of like why, he's not at fault and actually they're at fault and he's going to sue them and all this kind of stuff. Yeah.
This is William H. Gingrich, attorney at law. I am both shocked and dismayed to learn that my client has been deceiving me.
And so that, to me, while it's funny, it doesn't work because I think that Matthau probably should. He's a bad guy. Like, what he's doing is bad, and like you kind of want him to get his comeuppance, or like
I think that just reflects Billy Wilder's innate cynicism.
100%.
Which is he's just like, look, all these people are just motivated by money, and there are a lot of people out there that are like that, and they actually get away with it a lot.
Yeah,
I think that's kind of his take on that, and maybe all you can do is choose to be like Harry and not deal with those people, and you go find your boom boom. I don't know.
But I think you're right in that a more satisfying conclusion. Again, because you set up this whole like back and forth court case thing, and then they never go to court. Like it kind of feels like a cop out, and it's unsatisfying. That's how I feel about this movie, is that there's great performances. There's a lot of great dialogue in this. Like I've written down so many of my favorite lines in this movie, but it's an unsatisfying viewing experience because it never manages to pull all those pieces together in a way that works for me.
Right. I think actually the climax is the problem for me. Like, I like the reveal at the end of the climax, but this movie doesn't ever quite get big enough for me. What I want is the scheme to start to unravel a bit, even if they like figure it out at the end.
You want
like
Some Like It Hot. Like that's
exactly
like that's why that movie works, is because then they get in over their head and they're like, how are we going to get out of this?
That's the thing that's missing, I think, from this movie, is that moment of being like, oh crap, the plan's not going as we thought, and now we have to deal with all of this craziness. Like, and you know, because the whole point of the scheme is that they're going to settle, right? Yeah. And so if they aren't able to settle and they go to court, that's like a way to kind of like be like, oh crap, that's not what they wanted, and now they have to figure out how to win the case, and that wasn't the whole thing, and you know, like shenanigans ensue. And like I feel like something like that, whether it's a going to court or something else, would have just put it over the top for me. Whereas, you know, kind of instead what you get is you get this parallel action of just like, you know, Matthau's over here negotiating the settlement, right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of boring, honestly. That part I don't really like very much.
Yeah.
I like what Matthau's doing with his character, but other than that, it's not very exciting to watch. And then you have what's going on in the apartment and the bugging and all of that kind of stuff. And it just never escalates to the point of being like the sort of farce that you really want, I guess.
Yeah. I did want to ask you, though, because, like, Nate, you sort of have established on this show that, like, you're not as big into comedy film. Yeah. I think you're a very funny individual and that you have a great sense of humor, but, like, you do not consider comedy to be your, like, genre. So I was curious how you felt about the comedy of this film, because it is either predominantly physical gags or just, like, really clever lines of dialogue.
When I was doing the research for this, I came across a quote from Wilder that I felt like really summarized my feelings about it. So I think it was an interview from Sight and Sound.
Okay.
Where he was, you know, talking about his career at large, but there was a moment where he started talking about this movie and also The Apartment, and he was sort of asked about the comedy in those.
Right.
And basically what he said was, of course, they aren't really comedies. He said, we sugarcoated them with a few laughs here and there, but what I wanted to say in them finally was, human beings are human beings. And he basically thought, you know, that most people will do almost anything for money, right?
Interesting.
And I think that is the best way to think of it, is the comedy in this is sugarcoating a light drama.
Yeah.
That's how I would describe it. Is it's like, it's mostly a drama, honestly. And it just happens to have like some funny lines and then like these performances that kind of put it into comedy territory from Lemmon and Matthau mostly, right? But it is mostly like how it's delivered. It's not so much the premise or the plot. Like, it doesn't ever go into farce, right? And instead, it's really kind of this, just like a story that's told in a slightly comedic fashion, maybe.
Yeah, obviously that has become very popular in the last 20 years. I mean, we're watching or rewatching, actually, the show Shrinking on Apple TV.
Yeah, great show.
Which is, it's a perfect example of this. Like, it's about a very serious subject, but it's also laugh out loud funny. But I don't know that I could describe it necessarily as a comedy. You know, there's that term dramedy, which I think is a terrible term, but like it's kind of the only term we have for this genre of like serious subject that uses humor to diffuse what is otherwise a very difficult watch, maybe. Like, I wish there was a better term for it. Like, we could come up with a term for it, but not you and I just mean at large. But
let's do it right now.
Yeah, let's come up with it right now, and we'll be in the OED. No. That's interesting. I didn't really think about it that way, but I'm inclined to agree. This is not a comedy like Some Like It Hot is a comedy.
Right.
It's not even, and it's not a comedy even like What's Up Doc is a comedy.
Right. Totally.
Like, it is funny. That's another one of the things that just wasn't working for me, was like,
the tone is a little hard to pin down.
Yeah, and I was like, this isn't that funny for a funny movie.
Right, but it's also not that dramatic for a drama.
Exactly. It's kind of middling.
It's neither here nor there, I think, in terms of the tone, and I think it could use a little bit more. Like, either it needs some moments that are really touching or really tough, or it needs some real laugh out loud comedy.
What about like the overall craft of the film? What were your thoughts of how Wilder put this together? Like, did you like it? Did it feel dated?
In some ways, it's like right down the middle, right? But then it does have these little flourishes. Like, something we didn't talk about is that there are these chapter titles.
Yeah.
Which is a really weird choice. It's really interesting. I don't really know where that comes from. Again, couldn't find any details about where that comes from, but it's almost like a book, like you're reading a novel. So each one has like a number and a title that precedes like usually one scene or maybe a couple scenes in a row.
Yeah.
And there's probably like a dozen of them or more. That actually made me think maybe that's why this episode of The Simpsons actually has its title at the beginning, is that it's actually a reference to that, but they just forgot when they were doing the commentary. Again, it's like 10 years later. So like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You might just forget that that's in this movie, but I think that's probably the origin of why this episode has its title, because it also has the episode number.
Yeah. Yes.
So anyway, the score is great. It's got this like sleazy jazz score that's like perfect for the Matthau character. Like, it's really emphasizing that what kind of person this is, but it's also kind of cool, right? Like, it's not a villainous score, but it's almost like Pink Panther sort of vibes.
Very much so, yeah. Well, and then the cinematography was the thing that I really wanted your take on, because like, as soon as the movie started and I saw that it was in scope, I was like, whoa, I wasn't expecting that.
Right.
Like, and again, maybe this is just like the studios at this time were like, everything has to be in big widescreen because we want to be different from TV.
Yeah.
But then it doesn't do anything with it. It's like you're shooting a movie in scope that mostly takes place in an apartment, a hospital bed, and like a lawyer's office. Like, it's so unnecessary.
Totally. Yeah, it's very staid. And I think this does reflect Wilder's broader philosophy. You know, again, I think this is from the same interview, but basically he's asked about cinematography and he basically says, I don't like the audience to be aware of camera tricks. Why shoot a scene from a bird's eye view or a bug's? I guess they call that kind of thing stylish or beautifully conceived. It's all done to astonish the bourgeois, to amaze the middle-class critic. And I think he kind of compares it to like commercials, right?
Right.
And it's interesting because, of course, like, we're from a generation where it's like some of our favorite directors came out of music videos, and they have the exact opposite philosophy, which is like, why would you do something in a boring way when you could do it in an interesting way?
And not only that, like, that's a weird take for the guy who made Sunset Boulevard to have,
right?
Because like Sunset Boulevard is, exactly. Like you referenced the pool shot, like that is such a cool. Like,
in this movie, there are like only a handful of moments where something out of the ordinary happens. Like, the big move that this movie has, I feel like, is the push in and the pull out.
Yeah, totally.
And it's like, we'll talk about the titular Chinese lunch scene at some point here. But like, that's one of the moments where you get a push in and a pull out to just kind of like emphasize a moment in the script. But like, really, all we're talking about here basically is framing to like get the right characters in the shot. Or when they're in the apartment and they're under surveillance, you'll get a lot of shots where it's like, it's a person in the foreground, but you can clearly see the camera poking through the window in the background.
Yeah.
Like, he's using it for story. That's
there's
the
a little bit of experimentation in the scenes where the lawyer's doctors are testing him, and they bring in the German doctor and everything, because they're trying to put you in like Lemmon's headspace of like, oh, am I going to get caught? So they make it sort of very dramatic and like, But that's sort of the only real like experimentational element in the film. The thing I kept thinking about is like, this is my sort of quintessential way of how I think comedies tend to be shot. We set the camera up, we let the scene unfold, because the cinematography is not why you're here. You're here for the story and the laughs. It's movies like this that make movies like The Graduate and Annie Hall completely break my brain in high school, because I'm like, holy shit, like, comedies can actually do something with their camera? Like, they never did that.
Yeah, but there's also like lots of middle ground. Like I think about one of my favorite movies, When Harry Met Sally, right? Mm-hmm. It's interesting because it has the to camera interviews, right?
Yes,
which are very like formally experimental.
Yeah.
But like when you look at the scenes in between that are sort of straight rom-coms, it's mostly just people talking.
Yeah,
but the thing is, they do it in interesting places. They go to the Met. They walk through Central Park. It's just like they dress it up so that it feels visually interesting, and I like, of course, I recognize that's 30 years later. So it's like there are limitations on what you can do at this point to a certain extent.
But that being said, The Graduate...
they are trying to shoot on location in this movie. Like they go to a stadium, they shoot during a football game. Like there is some stuff that happens like that. But man, for a lot of this, it feels like you were just in a pretty nondescript room.
But The Graduate's the next year. It's 1967.
True.
Like, so... Yeah. I think the cinematography of this film and the fact that it's in black and white, despite it being the mid-60s, definitely lends this film a sort of old-fashioned feeling that, like, this is the kind of movie that if you were to show it to a younger generation, they'd be like, I don't want to watch this. It looks old, right?
Yeah.
Like, and there's nothing to get past that.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, this is the kind of movie that The Graduate kind of makes extinct, I think, in some ways. It's sort of like The Graduate is the big sign that it's like, okay, here's the asteroid, like we're, time to pack it up.
But I remember watching Some Like It Hot in middle school. I have no idea why they I think because maybe the music scenes or whatever. And Marilyn Monroe was having that renaissance when we were in like grade 6 and 7. So anyway, we watched Some Like It Hot in class one day. And most of the class was like, why are we watching this movie? It's in black and white.
Right.
And I had seen it before. And I'm like, no, you don't understand. This movie's hilarious. Like, give it a chance. And by the end, like, they more or less did. But sometimes that stuff really does kind of work against it, I guess. But
yeah, for sure. Well, Adam, were there any, despite your qualms, were there any scenes that kind of like stood out to you as being this movie at its best? Whether it's about the comedy or the drama or anything?
I really love the Chinese takeout sequence.
Yeah.
And you don't really understand, like, it's set up that, he's not going to have lunch because he's getting a Chinese takeout. Yeah. And you're sort of like, what? Like, what the hell are you talking from? Where's this coming from? And then you realize the Chinese takeaway is actually a way of Matthau smuggling in drugs that he's going to inject Lemmon with so that he can hopefully pass these tests.
Right. And this is where you get the Dr. Nick type.
100%. And and you get one of my favorite lines in the movie, which is like...
You'll be careful, won't you, Doc?
I better be, because I'm on parole.
Parole?
Yeah, they caught me tampering with a horse at Arlington Park.
A veterinary?
Well, actually, he's a dentist.
Which, as the son of a dentist, they're a little shady. I feel like it's the film at its best. It's a little bit wacky. It's got some clever dialogue. It's got great performances. And then you get some physical stuff. That really, really worked for me. What about for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that scene is the standout. There's a reason why this movie's called The Fortune
The Fortune Cookie, yeah, exactly.
Right? And it's partly because, the titular fortune cookie happens at the end of this scene where he opens up the fortune and it says, you can fool all the people some of the time and some of the people all of the time, but you cannot fool all the people all of the time. And it's actually probably not a real quote from Abraham Lincoln, but it's, attributed to him.
Well, and we have previously referenced it because he was watching an old movie about Lincoln on TV in hospital.
Yes. It might even be at the beginning of that scene when they come in, he's watching it. So I think the idea is that he sort of like sees this as a sign because it's just come up twice and he's obviously trying to fool people. They're all trying to fool people. So there's this sort of sense of like the comeuppance is coming, like you can't escape the fact that you're lying. So that's part of it. But also like this scene more broadly, to your point, is when this movie is cooking. You get the Lemmon and Matthau dynamic. It's starting to feel a little bit more farcical, I would say.
Yes.
And
there's energy.
There's energy. You don't know what's going on. And then it's revealed that it's not what you think it is. And like that stuff is maybe, I think, where this movie should have gone harder on. That would be my preference, is seeing more scenes like that.
100%.
Rather than going in like a more dramatic direction, for example. But it doesn't quite have enough scenes like that. The other thing that really stood out to me was the wheelchair. So in this movie, Lemmon's character is, faking his injury. But in order to successfully do that, he is in an electric wheelchair for most of this movie.
Yes.
And
that was like, donated by the team and brought to him by Boom Boom.
Yes, exactly. Just adding to the layers of guilt, right?
Yes.
Interesting thing, though, is that I was like, okay, 1966, like when did electric wheelchairs become a thing?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And so I looked this up, and apparently it was invented by a Canadian, an engineer named George Klein. So that's kind of cool. They were first mass produced in 1956. So that's about like 10 years before this movie. But I went down this rabbit hole of like, what other movies even feature an electric wheelchair around this time? I think this has got to be one of the first.
Probably, yeah.
And it features it really prominently. Like, not only is he in the wheelchair for a lot of the movie, but like the thing that stood out to me as like these great scenes are like, he is using it in this way that is graceful and funny. And there's a lot of wheelchair dancing in this.
Yeah.
There's like a scene where he races down the hospital hallway in this wheelchair. And it's kind of beautiful. And like, I wonder if a filmmaker like Wilder is probably always looking for something that you've never seen on film before, you know, whether it's a set piece or a location or something. And I wonder if there was ever a moment where he was just like, hey, you know, like, we're doing this medical thing. Like, what about an electric wheelchair? Like, this technology is relatively new. You can do all sorts of cool things with it. So let's build some set pieces around this electric wheelchair. And I just found those to be like a joy to watch. And there's no dialogue in those scenes. You're just watching Jack Lemmon do his Jack Lemmon thing and like move around his apartment and dance and sing, but in a way that you probably had never seen on film before. So I thought that was very cool.
Totally. Okay, Nate, well, the last thing before we sort of wrap this up is I did want to talk a little bit about the ending. I mean, we've talked a little bit about the ending already, but like, I guess the question that I had was like, how did you feel about the final like button with Boom Boom and the like playing the football and you know, him getting fired and then Lemmon showing up? What's your thoughts on that? Did you think it was necessary? Did it feel a bit like hat on a hat? What's your take?
Okay, I think I know what your take might be.
But although I will, you know what? I will say I think you've convinced me of its necessity a bit more through this conversation than maybe when I watched it originally. But that being said, what's your take?
I mean, so backing up to the climax itself, what happens is you think that they've won, right? They have the check in hand. The private eyes are packing up, and the private eye comes by the apartment, and you know, you can tell that Jack Lemmon's kind of like not sure, like he's feeling guilty and all of that. The private eye starts taking down all the bugs, and then he sort of makes a casual racist comment about Boom Boom.
Yes.
And that's what sort of prompts Harry to like get up out of his wheelchair. He punches him in the face. And then, as you said, like, you know, the other private eye across the way doesn't actually get the shot. And then Jack Lemmon coaches him through getting the shot. He's like, do you want a second take? Basically.
Yeah.
That is probably one of the best comedic moments and a good payoff for the whole story, despite our other qualms. But I feel like that moment is really critical for the character, too. That's the moment where Harry realizes that not only does he feel like he's not doing the right thing, but he doesn't have his priorities straight.
Right.
Right. And at the end of the day, this person who came into his life because he was cheating him is actually the thing that he prizes the most. And he kind of cuts off ties, it seems like, with the Matthau character, with his ex-wife, with everyone. He's just kind of like, I'm out of here. And then he goes off and finds Boom Boom. Harry finds out that he's lost his job. His locker's cleaned out. And he's just like sitting in the stadium, presumably like one last look before he goes off and figures out what to do with his life, right? And so this is the end consequences of this scam, is that this you've essentially like ruined this person's career. And Lemmon comes clean with him, you know. He walks in, he's not in his wheelchair, and immediately Boom Boom finds out that he was lying, was never really that injured and all of that. And Boom Boom continues to be kind of the bigger person in this scene. Tells him that he's going to go move on with his life. And then Lemmon like throws him a football as he's walking away, and they like play a game of pickup football while the cleaning folks kind of watch them from the sidelines. And that's the end of the movie. And I don't know. I mean, it doesn't totally feel resolved in terms of what it all meant for those two characters, or like, where do they go from here? This could be the beginning of a beautiful friendship, as you know, or maybe this is just one last game and they're going to go their separate ways because they can't actually be friends after what happened. We're ending on this beautiful moment, but there's a little bit of bittersweetness or uncertainty. Whether it drives home like what the overall point of the movie was or not, I don't know. But it's also one of those things, kind of like this episode of The Simpsons, where it's like, well, you got to end it somehow.
Fair.
So how are we going to end it?
I guess for me, it's just like, and maybe it's just like a, it's the mid 60s and we wrote things differently back then. It just feels like we need to now just like lay everything out so that the audience very clearly understands what happened.
Right.
Like I think it's a stronger ending for Lemmon to just walk away, and like maybe we don't need to actively see all of the consequences and then see him come clean. I think that's what I take issue with, is that part of it is that the movie has just lost its steam for me by this point, and like I don't need another 10 or 15 minutes. But it kind of assumes that the audience needs to be told what happened.
Yeah. Let me give you a cut down version of the ending and let's see how it lands. So, because like there is a whole scene of like, he goes into the locker room, he talks to the coach. The coach is like, yeah, he's gone, blah, blah, blah. What if the movie instead, Lemmon walks out of the apartment, you cut to an external shot of the stadium, you see Lemmon walking in, he walks into the green immediately, sees Boom Boom. Boom Boom looks up surprised. Lemmon shrugs and then walks over to him. And then that's the end of the movie.
I think that would work better. There's a lot of logic here that, like, how does this guy get back on the green? Like,
For sure.
And maybe in between there, you have to see, like, Lemmon is despondent and is, like, standing out in the rain.
Right.
And he sees a newspaper headline that Boom Boom has been fired or something like
snappy. Like,
yes,
just give me the minimum amount of information I need and then get me to the ending, because I think the climax is done.
Yeah, that would work better for me. It's like, that's ultimately what it is. It's just too much, and it assumes the audience needs to be spoon-fed everything. I think I like your ending more. So, again,
I think
rewriting Billy Wilder.
I agree that it could be like cut down a little bit, because it does feel like the conflict of the movie is done. So now just give us a satisfying button.
This is why I say, like, I think there's a really great premise here. It just isn't being perfectly executed.
Right. Another candidate for a remake, honestly.
Yeah.
You'd have to change the style of it a little bit, but, like, I think there's a way to do it that you could really, juice this for a completely new movie.
I couldn't agree more.
All right, well, Adam, let's move on to our Simpsons speed round. And I do have a special question for you today.
Oh, okay.
That's specific to this movie, which is, at what point did you think Walter Matthau sounded the most like Homer in this movie?
I did actually write this down in my notes.
Because, again, if we haven't said it, Homer's voice in the shorts was an impersonation of Walter Matthau. And in the shorts, he sounds exactly like Walter Matthau.
He really does, yeah.
And then over the course of the first season, Dan Castellaneta has said that, like, that impersonation didn't really have enough range for the character. And so he had to kind of drop it into a different register in order to, like, get the oohs and the other things that Homer does all the time. Yeah. And it sort of evolved from there. But, like, it started as a parody of Walter Matthau doing these kinds of roles. So that's kind of interesting.
And I will say there are a couple of moments in the Simpsons episode where he does sort of slip back into that more Matthau-y intonation and stuff. I literally wrote in my notes, like, man, he really sounds like early Homer in this. And it was Chapter 7, the Gemini Plan, when I first noted that. But, yeah, there are definitely moments where it's a little like disorienting, because I guess it speaks to how good of an impression Dan Castellaneta was actually doing. But you definitely hear a little bit of Homer every once in a while throughout the movie.
Yeah, there was like a phone call at one point where the Matthau character's at home with his family, and he's calling the Jack Lemmon character.
Yes.
And he's talking softly or something.
Yeah.
He's not really doing the biggest version of the Whiplash Willie character. And I feel like that moment was the one where I was like, oh, that really sounds like Homer. So it's like the impression really does sound like Matthau, but only when Matthau is doing certain things.
Totally.
Okay, Simpsons speed round. Adam, are there any moments in this movie that feel like Simpsons jokes but aren't?
There were a couple lines of dialogue that I really had really Simpsons juice to it. The doctors especially. There's the line of like, the parents couldn't afford the operation, so I kept the 27 cents. It's a throwaway line as they're walking into a room, which is sort of like a classic Simpsons thing of like, you're kind of just getting the button of a joke or a story. But also just this idea that this doctor is, not on the up and up. It's that Simpsons cynicism.
Exactly.
Of for-profit healthcare.
Okay. Did you learn anything about The Simpsons from this movie?
No, I guess it's really just this idea of like, they can see a good premise, even if it's coming from something that's not working. Even if, again, I don't think the episode totally works because of the ending, but like they recognize there's a nugget here that's worth sort of poking at.
Yeah, great point. The big find for me was like, I never thought of Lionel Hutz as being the result of a parody of this movie, but I think that's totally true, even if the character is a little different than the Matthau character.
Yeah.
The role he plays is the reason why we have Lionel Hutz on the show.
Yep.
Okay. Does this movie still have some juice for other Simpsons parodies?
No, I don't think so.
No, I don't. Me neither. No. You don't want a Boom Boom Jackson like storyline through there?
No.
Okay. All right. Are there any characters in this movie that could become a recurring Simpsons side character?
The private investigator character, I could see there being something similar, at least in like those earlier seasons, maybe less so now. At the end of the day, though, you see how much Gil, it's not just Jack Lemmon and Glengarry Glen Ross, it's just Jack Lemmon. He's riffing on all of the Lemmonisms, and you see so many of them here.
Totally, yeah. I think the desperation element is the thing they take from Glengarry Glen Ross, but like the characterization is, as you say, it's just Jack Lemmon and like all of his tics and stuff. The thing that I was thinking about is Hutz was retired from the show after the untimely death of his voice actor. However, do they actually have a character now that like plays the lawyer role? I actually think Gil becomes a lawyer at one point.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
In some episodes, but I'm kind of like, should they have another like lawyer character that is like a sleazy lawyer, maybe in a slightly different mold than Lionel Hutz? Because like there are a lot of episodes where they go to court. And so, I kind of feel like there's room for another lawyer character that is the person that the Simpsons would work with. Because obviously the blue-haired lawyer is always the villain lawyer.
Yeah, he would need to be a sleazy but competent lawyer.
Exactly, yeah. You need
the opposite of Hutz, which is he's sleazy and he's a bad lawyer.
Right. I feel like there could be like a Whiplash Willie character. Okay, are there other movies by this director or in this franchise that The Simpsons should parody?
Well, originally, I didn't really think so because I was like, they've definitely covered all the heavy hitters. But you having told me that Sunset Boulevard wasn't covered, that seems like,
Yeah, I think
right
that's got to be
parody.
Yeah,
so.
It's such a good story. It's got all the elements of like some of my favorite episodes where there is a mystery and a kind of like juicy plot, but it's also ripe for funny moments. So totally. I think that would be awesome. I would love to see it. And that's it.
That's it. That takes us to the question we always ask each other at the end of these, which is, Nate, do the strengths outweigh the weaknesses? Would you recommend this film?
This is a tough one, honestly. This movie is very inoffensive. Like, if you spend an evening watching this, you're probably going to come away being like, yeah, that was all right. And if you like Jack Lemmon and you like Walter Matthau, you're going to see the seeds of what becomes their longtime partnership here.
Yeah.
And that definitely is here. It's just that the story and some of the other aspects of the movie don't quite match that level of greatness. But like, yeah, I think I would recommend this. It's just not like a strong recommendation.
Right.
What about you?
Yeah, it's definitely what I would refer to as like a Sunday morning or Sunday afternoon movie where like you would see it on TV and you're watching it, you're kind of half watching it while you're doing other stuff.
Right.
I don't know that I would recommend it. There's so much better stuff in the Billy Wilder oeuvre that I would prioritize that over anything else. Like, unless you're doing like the Billy Wilder filmography, then I would maybe recommend it. But no, I think your 2 hours is better spent watching something else.
Yeah, personally. That's fair. If you had to prioritize, I would say that there are definitely other things to prioritize, both from Wilder and from Lemmon and Matthau.
Yeah.
So like, this is like way down the list of priority, but also like, you're not going to be mad probably coming away from this. It's just not going to be the best movie you've ever seen.
I guess what it comes down to for me is like, I'm in this weird situation with the age that my son is at, where I have a very finite amount of time to myself and a very finite amount of time to be able to watch movies.
Totally.
And I don't love that I spent that finite amount of time this week watching this movie.
Yes. This was a public service more than a personal pleasure. Sure.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense. Adam, what about extra credit in terms of like other movies that you recommend as like a double bill or maybe instead of this movie? What would you say?
Well, to my point, I think if you're going to spend 2 hours watching a Billy Wilder movie or a Billy Wilder comedy, you're much better off watching Some Like It Hot, which is a movie that I do think holds up.
Sure. And you got Lemmon.
And you got Lemmon. The AFI voted it the funniest American film of all time. I don't necessarily agree with that.
Sure.
But I do think that for a movie that's it's over 70 years old now, it does hold up surprisingly well. Lemmon's so good in it. Tony Curtis is so good in it.
Yeah.
And Marilyn Monroe is actually like really good in it. So yeah, that would be my recommendation.
Okay. Yeah, I like it.
What about you?
I often end up going in weird directions with this, but when I was doing research for this, trying to find any information about this movie, one of the things I came across was that apparently P.T. Anderson presented this movie at the American Cinematheque in 2022.
Okay, interesting.
And there's like no video, there's no like transcript or write-up of like what he said or why he chose this movie or anything other than the fact that it happened. But that made me think about like, what did P.T. Anderson see in this movie? Like, why this movie? And so the movie of his oeuvre that I was like, oh, okay, I can kind of see the connection here is Punch Drunk Love. And I think like there's a few things going on here. It's also what I would describe as a dramedy. It picks a lane, though, in that I think it leans more towards the drama, maybe even a bit of a thriller side.
Yeah.
That really works. But the character is kind of similar. Like the main thing that this character is dealing with is loneliness and looking for connection and meaning in all the wrong places. There is a harebrained scheme at the middle of this movie as well that goes awry. And again, like escalates to a place that is way bigger and scarier than this movie. So it's like, I think it's playing with some of the same elements, but obviously puts like the P.T. Anderson spin on it. And I think it ends up being both funnier and more thrilling than this movie.
You introduced me to that movie many, many years ago. And I don't think I've seen it since I saw it in high school, and I remember really, really liking it. But I think I may need to revisit that. I'm not a huge fan generally of P.T. Anderson's movies because they all tend to be overly long and overly serious. But I remember really and also just being sort of blown away by like the Adam Sandler of it all. Of like,
he's great.
Crap, he's amazing. So, and it's only 91 minutes, I think. 95 minutes. So it's that's definitely right up my alley.
Totally.
So.
I think it's the first P.T. Anderson movie I saw. I'm a huge fan of P.T. Anderson, but it's an interesting lens to think about his filmography in general because it is a little bit less serious in certain ways, but also like has the heft of many of his other movies.
Totally.
And I feel like because it's a little bit more comedic, it helped me see the comedy in his other movies. Like he loves the awkwardness and big personalities. That's the thing that comes through, I think, for me.
Totally.
But great movie. So, yeah, that would be my recommendation.
Awesome. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of the Springfield Googleplex, the movie podcast for Simpson fans. If you enjoyed what you heard, please leave us a review. We should have mentioned this sooner, but if you do leave us a review, we'd be happy to read it out on the show, give you a little shout out. I mean, unless it's like really nasty, but at this point we don't have many to read. So even if it is nasty, we might just read it anyway, but
we'll just bleep it if it's
exactly
a problem.
But yeah, so leave a review, share this episode with the Simpson fans and film buffs in your life. We've also set up a support page on our website where if you want, you can throw us a couple of bucks to help cover the cost of making this show. Everything helps and we really, really do appreciate it. Until next time, Nate,
we'll see you around the Plex.
Bitty, 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 bitty.